He returned to Marienhafe with salt on his lips and an old sound in his bones. Ted Harkin leaned into the wind as marsh water slapped the dike below him. Salt stung his lips. Ahead, Marienhafe crouched under a low sky, and from the tidal flats came a thin bronze cry that made the men at the gate cross themselves. Ted stopped walking. He knew that voice. No one greeted him by name. 2 boys stared at the scar along his jaw and ran for the square. An old dog barked once, then backed under a cart. Ted kept his bundle on his shoulder and stood beneath the broken church tower, where the beam for the parish bell still hung empty after 8 years. The sound came again, not from the tower, from the west mud, where black reeds bent in the evening wind. It rose and faded like metal drawn by a wet finger. The air smelled of brine and peat smoke. Women shut shutters along the lane, though night had not yet fallen. Pastor Eno stepped from the porch with a lamp in his hand. His beard had gone white since Ted last saw him. He looked first at Ted, then at the mudflats beyond the dike. "You should not have come on this week," the pastor said. Ted lowered his bundle. "The flats are singing. They began 3 nights ago," Eno replied. "The old people say the sea counts before it takes." That cut through the wind harder than any blade. Ted saw again the storm lantern swinging madly, the belfry groaning, the great cracked mouth of the bell, and water racing over the fields where half the parish had been caught. He had fled before dawn with silver hidden in his wagon and shame packed deeper than the chest beneath his feet. Now the sea had found his buried fault and was giving it a voice. A crowd formed without anyone calling for one. Fishermen with tar on their sleeves. Mothers with cloaks pulled tight. A widow named Swantje stood in front, thin as a reed, her eyes fixed on him. Her husband had drowned in that flood. Her son had drowned too, 2 winters later, trying to hold a weak bank with bare hands. "You hear it?" she asked. Ted nodded. "Then answer it," she said. A murmur moved through the square. Some wanted him turned away before dark. Some wanted him forced onto the flats, to see if the sea named him. Ted opened his bundle and set down the tools he had carried across 3 bishoprics, mold knives, wax cords, a small hammer, his measuring rod. The iron smelled cold in his own hands. "If the sound is what I think," he said, "it comes from the bell I made. Its pieces lie under the mud. The tide passes over them and wakes them." Silence held for one hard breath. He had spoken the truth at last, and truth moved faster than any tide. Faces tightened. A child began to cry. Pastor Eno raised his lamp until its light struck Ted full in the face. "Then you will come with us to the flats at dawn," the pastor said. "And if the bronze is yours, you will answer for all of it." Where the mud began to sing. At first light they walked onto the flats behind Ted, each step sinking with a soft pull. The mud smelled of salt, rot, and eel grass. Pastor Eno led with a staff. Swantje came too, though the path bit at her old knees. No one offered Ted a place among them. He walked ahead because he knew where shame had been buried. From the wet earth rose the old bronze, still carrying its wound. The tide had gone out far enough to bear long ribs of sand. Red weed clung to pools between them. Ted listened, head tilted, until the wind shifted. Then the note came, low and trembling. He followed it to a shallow channel where water streamed through a bed of shell and black silt. He knelt and pushed both hands into the cold mud. The chill ran to his elbows. His fingers touched metal. He dug faster, breath short, and lifted a curved piece of bronze with barnacles on one edge. A crack ran through it like lightning frozen in brown-green skin. No one spoke. The water hissed around their boots. Ted wiped the fragment with his sleeve. Along the rim, beneath the salt crust, lay his own maker's mark, a small 6-pointed star he had once struck with pride. He closed his hand over it, but not before Swantje saw. "It is yours," she said. "Yes." The word left him plain and bare. He did not look at them when he spoke next. "I thinned the wall to save metal. I mixed church silver into the bronze, then kept part of the silver back. When the storm came, the bell cracked during the warning peal. Men lost the signal. Water crossed the fields before half the parish reached high ground. The marsh seemed to flatten under that confession. Even the gulls had gone quiet. One fisherman stepped forward with both fists closed. Another caught his sleeve before he reached Ted. Pastor Eno planted his staff in the mud. "You ran." "Yes. And now?" Ted looked over the flats toward the village, small on its rise beyond the dike. Smoke lifted from cook fires. Somewhere a child would be asking for bread, and a mother would be counting what little flour remained before market day. He had once looked at such homes and seen only what metal they might yield. Now he saw doors people had closed against weather for generations, and hands that had buried too many names. Now I will recast it, he said. No stolen silver, no trick in the wall. Let each house give what it can spare, and I will cast a bell from the village itself. If it fails, I stay. If it rings true, it belongs to them, not to me. A laugh broke from the back, sharp as a snapped twig. What can poor people spare? A woman called. A spoon, a hook, a wedding ring from a grave. Swanche bent down, opened Ted's stiff fingers, and took the bronze shard from his hand. She weighed it once, as if measuring the years inside it. My husband heard the cracked bell, she said. So did my son. If this mud has carried their last sound all these winters, let the new bell carry their names instead. I will give my ring. Not for you, for them. She pulled a narrow widow's ring from a cord at her neck. The gold had worn thin with years of skin and weather. She placed it in Ted's muddy palm. That was the first offering. It was small, yet it changed the air. Pastor Eno removed a silver baptism spoon from his satchel. A fisherman cut free 3 brass hooks from his line wrap. A seamstress unclasped her bent thimble. One by one, people reached into pockets, aprons, purses, and cords around their necks. The gifts made soft sounds in Ted's hand, no louder than rain on wood. He bowed his head, not from custom but because he could not hold their eyes. By noon they had lifted 6 bell fragments from the mud. Ted laid them in a cart lined with rushes. The largest piece still bore a smear of dark ash from the old furnace. When he touched it, he remembered the night he had cheated the melt, how greed had felt hot and clever, like a secret no one could smell. He knew better now. Wrongdoing always had a smell. Sometimes it was smoke in wet wool. Sometimes it was salt in a graveyard wind. The furnace fed by small things. Ted set his furnace in the lee of the smithy wall, where the wind struck less hard. He rebuilt it from old brick, clay, and straw, pressing each seam with care that made the apprentices whisper. Children carried peat blocks in baskets. Men brought charcoal in sacks. Women came after market and laid their offerings on a plank table covered with clean linen. Small things from many homes fed the fire more faithfully than stolen silver. The table filled slowly, a bent spoon with a chased cross on its handle, a fish knife with the edge worn dull, tiny buckles from a dead child's shoes, net weights, hook shanks, cuff pins, a copper brooch with its hinge gone, and coins saved for years against hunger. Ted sorted each piece by metal and weight. He called out what he received, and Pastor Eno wrote every gift into the parish book. This was the first bridge between them. No one spoke about right or craft. They spoke about need. A mother touched the silver spoon she had brought from her daughter's baptism and stood still for a long moment before letting it go. A fisherman set down the brass hook that had belonged to his father and rubbed the empty place in his palm. Ted saw that each piece had first lived in a hand, at a table, or beside a cradle. The bell would not be cast from wealth. It would be cast from memory. Work drew the village close, though trust did not come so quickly. When Ted measured wax strips for the false bell and trimmed the pattern letters, boys gathered to watch. He kept his voice steady and showed them how a bell's lip must hold enough thickness to carry sound through rain. He did not hide his tools. He did not step away from the scales. If he left the workbench, he left the weights in Eno's keeping. Swanche came each day and said little. She sat on an upturned cask, mending a torn sleeve or gutting herring for supper while the furnace dried. Sometimes she looked at the broken tower. Sometimes at Ted's hands. On the 4th evening she asked, "Why return at all?" Ted shaved tallow from a candle stub into the wax pot. "Because I heard, in another port, that the old tower still stood empty." "That is not enough." He stirred until the wax shone smooth. "No, it is because I grew tired of eating bread bought with a lie." Swanche's knife paused against the herring skin. "And did the bread choke you?" "Some nights." She nodded once, not in pardon, only in recognition. She had buried 2 men and still rose before dawn to gut fish. There are griefs that need no speech. That was the second bridge between them. 3 days later, with the mold pit ready, Ted faced the matter he feared most. The old bell had failed not only from theft but from his pride. He had cast it alone, refusing advice from an older founder who warned him about the damp sea air and the cooling rate. This time he called the smith, the cooper, and even a shepherd who knew clay by touch from cutting banks. They argued over vent holes, over furnace draft, over the mold jacket. Ted accepted each useful word and gave ground where once he would have fought. The apprentices noticed. So did the elders. A man does not become clean in 1 hour, but people can see when he stops protecting his stain. When the day for the melt came, the village gathered in work clothes and prayer cloaks. Heat rolled from the furnace mouth and carried the harsh smell of charcoal. Bronze sweated, then softened, then turned to a moving orange skin under the slag. Ted skimmed impurities with a long iron spoon. His arm shook from strain, yet he did not let another hand take the task he had once betrayed. Pastor Eno read aloud the list of offerings before they poured. Each name entered the smoke: Jerk's hooks, Ilsa's thimble, Martin's spoon, Swanch's ring. Children craned on their toes to hear family names. Some wept quietly, some stood with jaws set hard. Ted heard the names and understood that if this bell cracked, it would crack through all of them. He gave the signal. Men tipped the crucible. Metal streamed into the mold with a deep, heavy rush, like grain pouring into a stone bin. No one moved until the last glow vanished below the clay mouth. Then came the waiting, which is its own trial. Night fell. The tower beam creaked in the wind. Out on the flats, the strange tones returned, thinner now, as if the sea listened for what the village had done. The bell with ash in its skin, they broke the mold on the second morning after the pour. Steam rose where damp clay still held heat. Teddy struck the outer shell with a wooden mallet, then peeled it back in slabs. The bell emerged dark, almost black in places where ash had settled into the cooling skin. Under the soot, faint threads of silver and brass moved through the bronze like old river lines in earth. The new bell carried ash on its skin and the whole village in its metal. No one cheered yet. Ted crouched and ran his hand along the waist, then the sound bow, searching for hairline marks. He found none. The letters he had cut stood clear around the shoulder: Maria Bewar Unsvor der Flut. Mother of Mercy, keep us from the flood. The words belonged to the parish, not to him, and he stepped back so the others could read them. Swanche reached first. She touched the metal with 2 fingers and then pressed those fingers to her brow. Pastor Eno bowed his head. One by one, villagers laid their palms against the bell. Some smiled with pain still inside it. Some stood in silence, taking in the weight of what they had given. When Ted tapped the rim with a light hammer, the note rose clean and deep. It carried over the square and struck the dike beyond. A child laughed aloud from sheer release. Then another note sounded from the flats, weaker and broken, the old buried bronze answering from under the mud. Faces tightened again. A rider came from the outer bank before noon, his horse splashed to the belly. North water, he called. The sea pushes hard. The channel posts are already half gone. By night the flood will climb the western dike. Men ran at once for shovels and wicker mats. Women carried rope, lamp oil, and bread. The church wardens argued whether to hang the new bell in the tower, but Ted stopped them. No time, he said. The beam must be fitted, the braces checked. If it falls in flood wind, the warning dies with it. Put it on the dike. A bell on open ground. One warden protested, where all can hear, and where I can ring until my arms fail. The village hesitated. The old fear sat among them, that his hand, once false, might again betray them. Ted understood. He took the hammer from his belt and laid it at Swanch's feet. Choose another ringer if you wish, he said. But set the bell on the west dike before dark. Swanche looked at the hammer, then at the black-brown bell. Wind drove her skirt against her ankles. At last she picked up the hammer and put it back into Ted's hand. You broke the first warning, she said. You will stand with the next one. All afternoon they hauled the bell on a timber sledge up the dike road. Oxen strained. Ropes bit shoulders. Wet grass slicked under boots. Ted walked backward in front, calling the pull, while boys wedged the runners with poles on each slope. By the time they reached the west bank, the sea had changed color. It no longer looked gray. It looked green-black, like iron under oil. They raised a frame from ship mast timber and lashed it with tar rope. Ted checked each knot himself. He bound the clapper and tested the swing. The bell's ash-dark skin drank the last of the evening light. Below them, women spread blankets in the church loft for children and old men. Carts creaked uphill with sacks, hens, and prayer chests. The village moved with the sharp quiet that comes when fear finally becomes work. Ted took his place under the frame while gulls wheeled low over the water. He could smell storm in the air now, that raw metal scent before heavy rain. The buried shards out on the flats gave one last broken call, and then the tide covered them. The night the dike held. Rain arrived in slanting sheets just after the first high push. It drummed on wood, wool, and water. Ted struck the bell 3 times, paused, then 3 times again, the warning pattern Enno had agreed upon. The sound rolled over the marsh and came back from the church walls full and stern. Lamps moved through the village lanes like shaken stars as the last families climbed to safety. He could not undo the old storm, so he stood through the next one. The sea hit the dike before midnight, not with one great blow, but with many. Wave after wave slapped the clay face, tore at the reed matting, and searched the weak spots with cold fingers. Men with spades rammed wicker and sawed into each fresh wound. Boys carried baskets of clay. Women hauled water for the workers and held lanterns low under cloaks to shield the flame. Ted rang until his palms blistered. The handle grew slick with rain and blood, though he barely noticed when the skin split. Each peal seemed to steady the people below. When a bank section sagged near the sheep pen, the bell called men to it. When a panic started among the cattle carts, the bell cut through shouting and pulled order back into the dark. Then the west post cracked. The timber frame lurched. The bell swung crooked and struck one beam with a dull, sick sound. For a breath all work stopped. Ted saw what the others saw. If the frame fell, the bell would smash on the slope, and the warning would end while the sea still climbed. "Rope!" he shouted. No one moved at first. The next wave hit hard, spraying their faces with brine. Ted jumped down into the mud, seized the listing post, and shoved his shoulder against it. The wood drove splinters through his tunic. Cold water rose around his boots. He felt the full weight of bronze drag against the failing frame. "Rope!" he shouted again. This time they came. The smith, the cooper, 2 fishermen, and Swanche herself with a coil over her arm. They looped the line under the crossbeam while Ted held the post upright. Mud sucked at his feet. Rain ran down his neck and into his eyes. He thought of the old night, the crack in the bell, the moment he had heard it fail and chosen himself over everyone else. He did not choose himself now. "Pull!" Swanche cried. They hauled together. The frame jerked back half a hand's width. Another wave struck. Ted's shoulder burned. His knees shook. Still he held. The smith drove an iron dog into the timber base with 3 hammer blows. The cooper wedged a spare axle under the beam. The frame steadied, not straight, but enough. "Back to the bank," Enno called. Ted climbed to the bell again, chest heaving. He looked once at Swanche. Rain streamed off her hood. She gave one sharp nod. That was all, yet it carried more than pardon spoken too soon. He rang on. Toward dawn the flood reached its highest mark. Water licked the top edge of the outer slope and spilled in thin silver threads through the grass, but the bank did not break. Men stood bent like old trees, shovels sunk in mud. Women prayed under their breath while binding fresh mats. Children huddled in the loft with blankets over their heads each time the bell sounded. At the darkest hour before morning, the wind shifted east. The next wave struck weaker. Then weaker still. Ted waited one beat, then gave a long peal that rolled clear across the whitening flats. No broken answer returned from the mud. The sea had covered the old fragments and moved on. When dawn came, Marienhafe still stood. The lower fields were drowned, and 2 goat sheds had washed away, but no grave was dug that day. Smoke rose from wet chimneys. People came down from the church hill in silence first, as if they feared speaking too soon might wake the water again. Ted climbed from the dike with stiff legs and torn hands. He meant to leave before the sun climbed high. A man who had broken so much had no claim to stay simply because he had done one thing rightly. He untied his travel bundle and slung it over his shoulder. Swanche met him at the footpath. She held out his maker's star, the small punch mark she had pried from one old shard before the rest went. "Back under tied and sealed. If you go," she said, "do not go as a man still hiding." Teddy took the punch but did not close his fist around it. "I can work until the tower beam is set," he said. "After that, if the village wishes, I will leave." Pastor Enno, standing a few paces away, answered before any other voice could rise. "You will stay until the bell hangs. After that, Marienhafe will decide." It was not welcome. It was not embrace. It was harder and better than either. It was a place to stand and labor under watchful eyes. By noon the clouds broke in narrow strips, and weak light touched the ash-dark bronze. Teddy put down his bundle, picked up his tools, and went to work beneath the empty tower.